Welcome back to the deep dive where, we take all the topics that you guys are curious about and, we dig through all the latest research, the best information we can find to really extract the key insights that help you guys stay ahead of the curve. And this time, well, you guys flagged an area that's definitely been generating a lot of buzz, and that's the development of specialized AI specifically for scientific discovery.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're looking to really, cut through the hype and understand the real advancements.
Yeah.
How is AI actually being used to kind of push the boundaries of science, right? And we found a really fascinating research paper that gets right at that.
It does. We're going to be diving into a paper today called OmniScience,
Yeah.
a domain-specialized LLM for scientific reasoning and discovery. Now, I know that sounds, incredibly technical and jargony, but what it really comes down to is this. It's about creating an AI that can think and reason like a scientist. And to do that, really accelerate the process of scientific discovery. That's what we're after.
Yeah, and our goal today is really to help you unpack the core ideas behind OmniScience. Explore its potential, right? I mean, this has the potential to revolutionize scientific progress, and we're going to highlight the key aha moments within the study, all without, getting lost in overly technical language. The goal is, by the end of this deep dives, you'll have a clear understanding of this cutting-edge work.
Okay, so let's unpack this. So the paper, it starts by highlighting the success we've already seen with large language models, or LLMs, across different scientific fields. And just to kind of level set for everybody, these are the AI models that can understand, process human language, at an incredibly massive scale. Think of them as like these really, really powerful language-based AI brains, right?
Yeah, they are. And what's really fascinating to consider is how these general-purpose LLMs, they're already showing value in science.
Yeah.
The paper points out their ability to extract critical information from complex research papers, process just tons and tons of data, and even synthesize findings to answer really specific scientific questions. They can even start generating new hypotheses, that's a big deal.
That is a huge deal. And, the potential to speed up discovery it's just enormous. The paper gives a compelling example of in battery research. They suggest that a science-focused LLM could rapidly screen like countless molecules to identify the promising candidates for better batteries. That would save an incredible amount of time and resources.
Well, absolutely. If you think about if you can automate that initial screening process, researchers, they can really focus their efforts on the most promising avenues. But, the paper also makes a point that while these general LLMs are really powerful, they do run into some limitations when you're dealing with truly complex scientific topics.
Yeah.
Because these require really deep, specialized knowledge.
Yeah, it's like asking a brilliant historian, someone who's, just a master in their field, to suddenly understand the intricacies of, particle physics. They might be able to grasp the terminology, right? But they lack that deep, really specific knowledge base. They don't have the contextual understanding.
Exactly. So general LLMs, they often lack the domain-specific vocabulary. And that nuanced contextual understanding that's really needed for this complex scientific reasoning. Think about, imagine trying to explain intricate molecular structures.
Yeah.
Or electrochemical properties of materials. Or even, patterns of gene expression to an AI that hasn't been specifically trained on that information. It's a fundamentally different challenge.
Right. So, we've seen this incredible progress in applying these LLMs to different fields, but the paper notes that, efforts to create specialized LLMs, but for general science, have been kind of limited.
Right.
We've seen successes in more narrow areas, like ChipNemo for designing computer chips, Bloomberg GPT for finance. But building, a broadly capable scientific AI, that's been a more complex, more difficult thing to do.
And that's really where OmniScience enters the picture. The researchers behind this paper, they recognize this gap, and they set out to develop a model that was specifically tailored to the entire scientific domain. That's why this is so significant. They weren't just fine-tuning an existing model. They were designing something really from the ground up, with the unique demands of scientific reasoning in mind.
So tell us about OmniScience itself. What is it about this approach that makes it different?
So OmniScience is built upon a really powerful foundation model called LAMO 3.170B. Now, that 70B, that refers to 70 billion connections, or what we call parameters, within the AI. Think of it as, a massive network of already encoded knowledge. And OmniScience builds upon this incredibly strong foundation rather than trying to start from scratch, which is huge in terms of efficiency. But the real innovation here lies in the three core stages that they use to develop it. Imagine it as a focused, three-part training program to turn a generally intelligent AI into a scientific expert.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. So break down these three crucial training stages for us.
Absolutely. So the first stage, they call this domain adaptive pre-training,
Right.
or DAPT. Think of this as giving the already intelligent, base AI like a deep immersion into the world of science. They take that llama model and they further train it on this massive, carefully curated collection of scientific literature. Think peer-reviewed research papers, comprehensive textbooks. This allows the model to really absorb the language, the core concepts, the established knowledge within all these scientific disciplines. And the paper actually mentions they used a corpus of about 35 billion tokens for this stage. That's an enormous amount of scientific text.
35 billion tokens. Just to kind of put that in perspective, that's like the AI reading the equivalent of a substantial portion of all the scientific knowledge that's ever been recorded. So that's step one, making sure this model is fluent in the language of science. What's next in this specialized training?
Right. So the second component is what we call instruction tuning. And this is done on a specialized data set. This stage is about, teaching the model to actually do scientific tasks, not just understand the text, right? It learns how to answer questions based on scientific information, summarize complex research findings, understand very specific instructions that you might give it within a scientific context, right? So it's kind of like giving your now science-savvy AI some practical experience, in a virtual lab setting.
So it's not just passively understanding the words, it's actively learning how to use that knowledge to solve problems and perform specific functions, like a real scientist would.
Okay, that makes sense. And what's the third piece of the puzzle? So the final key component is what they call reasoning-based knowledge distillation. Now, this is a bit of a more advanced technique, and it's aimed at significantly enhancing the model's ability to generate responses that are not only accurate, but they're logically sound and contextually relevant within the scientific framework. So it's about teaching it to think deeply, to connect different scientific ideas, and follow those logical reasoning chains, much like a seasoned scientist would.
Reasoning-based knowledge distillation. It sounds like a pretty crucial step in making this AI truly act like a scientist.
It is. Essentially what they're trying to do is transfer the sophisticated reasoning abilities of other, maybe more powerful, although less specialized AI models into OmniScience. So, if you go back to that athlete analogy, imagine you're already specialized athlete now getting coached by, an Olympic-level thinker in their sport to improve their strategic decision-making. That's kind of what OmniScience is going through. That refinement process, but for the entire world of science.
Yeah, that's a really helpful way to picture it. Okay, so let's dig into this training pipeline a little bit deeper. The first step, this domain adaptive pre-training, you mentioned that it was basically fed a massive amount of scientific text. So what exactly did that include? What kind of sources are we talking about here?
Yeah, the paper gets pretty detailed about this. So that pre-training collection, those 35 billion tokens, it was incredibly diverse. They pulled from 3.6 million peer-reviewed articles, early-stage research from platforms like ArXiv and ChemSoft, big databases like PubChem and Semantic Scholar, even full-text academic textbooks. I mean, they really aimed for broad coverage across a whole spectrum of scientific fields.
So for our listeners, the key takeaway here is they weren't just training this thing on a tiny subset of science, right? They were casting this incredibly wide net to build a really comprehensive foundation of scientific knowledge.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about feeding it raw data. They had this sophisticated data processing pipeline, right, to make sure that what the model was learning from was high quality. So first, they had to convert all these PDF files into plain readable text. Then they use these really clever techniques called min-hash and locality-sensitive hashing to do what they call fuzzy deduplication. Think about that as identifying and removing documents that are very similar, even if the wording is not exactly the same, making sure the data set was unique and not repetitive.
That's smart. You don't want it to just memorize the same concept over and over again, right? So what other steps did they take to kind of clean up and refine this data?
So they used a tool called Nemo Curator, and this did a bunch of pre-processing steps to enhance the quality of the data even more. So things like using heuristic filters to remove low-quality documents, identify and discard outliers, eliminate anything that had a lot of, repetition or noise. They were really meticulously curating this data set to make sure that the model was learning from the absolute highest quality scientific information available. And then finally, they used the same tokenizer, which is it's the way the AI breaks down text into manageable units, as the base LAME 3.170B model. So they prepared the text for training that way.
And then in terms of the actual training hardware and software, they built directly on top of that LLM 3.170B architecture, right?
That's right. So they essentially started with the pre-existing brain, all the already trained weights of the LAMA 3.170B model. And that was their starting point for OmniScience. So this saved them a tremendous amount of time and resources compared to, training something this large from scratch. They utilized the NVIDIA NeMo framework, which has some really advanced techniques like tensor parallelism and flash attention to make the training much more efficient and scalable. And they even use what's called context parallelism to handle those, really, really long scientific text. So they're training on sequences of up to 8,000 tokens at a time.
And this must have been incredibly computationally intensive. So roughly how long did this initial domain-specific pre-training phase take?
Well, even with 128 of NVIDIA's most powerful H100 GPUs working constantly, it still took about 6 days. Gives you an idea of just the scale and complexity of training these large language models.
Wow. Okay, so after this deep dive into the language of science, they moved on to the second stage. That's model alignment with supervised fine-tuning. So what was the goal of this phase for OmniScience?
So this stage is, as the paper highlights, it's really crucial for ensuring that the model can follow instructions accurately.
Right.
Even though it now has this vast understanding of scientific language, it still needs to learn how to apply that in a way that's useful for specific tasks a scientist might ask it to do.
So it's about teaching it to be a helpful assistant, not just a repository of knowledge. So how do they go about creating the data that's needed for this instruction tuning?
So they did something really clever here. They randomly selected 50,000 papers from that massive pre-training data set. And then they used another powerful AI model, GPT-4 Mini, to automatically generate synthetic instructions for each of those papers. So this included things like, creating question and answer pairs based on the paper's content, having it summarize key findings, reading comprehension exercises, even multiple choice questions, all based on the actual content of those papers. So this created this huge data set of 200,000 instruction samples.
That's really smart to create that large data set without having to go through this manual curation process.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they kept 160,000 of those AI-generated examples for training, set aside 40,000 for evaluation to see how well the model learned. And to make it even more versatile, they included 90,000 general chat instructions from a public data set. So this gave them a final supervised fine-tuning data set of 250,000 samples, covering specific science tasks and more general conversational abilities. So the model from this stage, they called it OmniScience Chat.
Okay, so OmniScience Chat can understand scientific language, it can follow instructions, but there's also a third stage, right, that was really focused on achieving these more advanced reasoning capabilities. So tell me about that final refinement.
Right. So this final stage really addresses the fact that, having a strong foundation in scientific knowledge and being able to follow instructions, they're essential, but they might not be enough for those really complex scientific problems, because often those require multi-step reasoning, synthesizing information from different sources, and integrating deep domain expertise. So that's where the reasoning-based knowledge distillation comes in.
So how did they go about doing that? How did they give it this more advanced level of scientific reasoning?
So they used a publicly available data set called S1K 1.1. Now, this data set is unique because it's derived from the reasoning processes of another very powerful reasoning model called DeepSeek R1. So it took examples of, how DeepSeek R1 reasoned through challenging questions. And they used that to further fine-tune OmniScience Chat. It's almost like, imagine OmniScience learning to think out loud, but in a more sophisticated scientific way, by studying the reasoning steps of a more advanced expert.
So it's learning from a more, expert level AI, how to think scientifically. How did they put together this S1K data set? It sounds like it was designed to be pretty challenging.
It was curated with a lot of rigor. So they started with a larger collection of samples, and then they did several key refinement stages. First, they implemented filters to remove low-quality samples that weren't complex enough. And then they had two different language models actually independently evaluate the difficulty of the questions. And they only kept the ones that both models answered incorrectly. So, very high level of difficulty. And then they filtered again to ensure diversity across topics. And they prioritized the samples with longer reasoning traces to capture those more complex thought processes. Really importantly, they also, what they call, decontaminated the S1K dataset. against popular benchmarks, including the same one they used later to evaluate OmniScience. So that ensured that it wasn't just memorizing answers. And then the specific version, the S1K 1.1, was generated using the reasoning traces of DeepSeek R1, which they found to be, particularly good for this task.
That's impressive. That's a lot of work to make sure that this data set was truly high quality and focused on complex reasoning. And so then they took that S1K data and they fine-tuned OmniScience chat with that.
Exactly. And they actually used a longer context window, 16,000 tokens during this fine-tuning. So the reasoning traces in S1K could be pretty long. And the extended context window let the model, really take in that whole reasoning process. And the fine-tuning took about 12 hours on 64 of those high-performance H100 GPUs. So that resulting model, they call that omniscience reasoning. And this one has those significantly enhanced, more sophisticated reasoning abilities, thanks to that knowledge distillation.
So we've gone from, general foundation model to one that understands scientific language to one that can perform tasks, and then finally one that has this enhanced reasoning expertise. That's quite a journey. So the paper also talks about a really practical use case here with what they call a battery agent. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, this is a really cool demonstration of how adaptable OmniScience is and its potential. The researchers wanted to show, a tangible example of how it could speed up discovery. So they designed this specialized battery agent. And the task was ranking different molecules based on their suitability as electrolyte solvents or additives in batteries. So this is a really crucial area of research. We all want better batteries.
And so how does this battery agent actually work? I mean, it's not just OmniScience on its own, right?
It's what they call a dual agent framework. They use what they call a generator agent, which is the OmniScience reasoning model, and a reflector agent, which uses a version of GPT-01. So the generator, it proposes an initial ranking of the molecules. It kind of gives them grades. And then the reflector evaluates those proposals, gives feedback, suggests refinements. It's like having a scientific discussion, right?
Yeah.
Between two AI agents. And the system also, it uses techniques like retrieval augmented generation, or RE. That lets it access relevant information from textbooks and research papers in real time. And it has this short-term memory, so it remembers the conversation. It's really impressive.
That's pretty wild. I mean, it's actually able to kind of justify its proposals based on this understanding of scientific knowledge. So what kind of results did they get when they tested this battery agent?
So they tested it on a set of about 700 molecules. And this included, 71 molecules that we already know are good electrolyte solvents in batteries. And they looked at how well the agent's rankings lined up with that knowledge, or the known good molecules at the top of the list. And the results were really good. So OmniScience reasoning, it performed much better than the base llama model. And even OmniScience chat. It was better at, grading the known good molecules, ranking them higher, and even, how many of them were in like the top 50 predictions. That hit rate was much, much higher, like almost 3 times higher for OmniScience reasoning.
Okay, so that's a real tangible example of how this AI can have an impact on scientific research. And, the paper also presents some benchmarks on more general scientific data sets, right? So how did it do on those?
Yeah, they tested it on what's called the GPQA Diamond benchmark. This is widely used for challenging science questions. And, this is really interesting. So omniscience reasoning, it has 70 billion parameters. But it actually did as well as, or even better than, state-of-the-art models like DeepSeek R1, which has almost 10 times as many parameters. So it's showing that this specialized training is really efficient.
So smaller but more focused means it can go head-to-head with these much bigger, more general models. That's a huge point. What about benchmarks that are more specific to battery science?
Yeah, so on those battery benchmarks, OmniScience reasoning did really well across a whole range of tasks: question answering, multiple choice questions, reading comprehension, summarization, even those more complex reasoning tasks specific to batteries. And again, it often beat out those larger models.
Okay, so this really tailored approach, it really seems to pay off. Now, the paper also talks about what are called ablation studies. What are those? What do those tell us about the training process?
Yeah, so ablation studies they're basically like taking the model apart piece by piece to see how important each piece is to the overall performance. So here they wanted to see how important is that domain adaptive pre-training and that reasoning alignment. And so they compared different versions of the model, one with just the reasoning distillation, one with just the domain pre-training, and then the full omniscience reasoning model.
And what did they find when they started removing those parts?
Well, the results showed very clearly that both the pre-training and the reasoning alignment were really important for getting the best results. The models without that specific scientific pre-training, they did much worse, especially on those complex reasoning tasks. So just having a general model and then trying to teach to reason is not enough. You need that deep scientific foundation first. And then, adding the reasoning distillation on top of that, that made a huge difference. So it really shows that that combination is the key.
It's not just one thing, it's this, carefully orchestrated process.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And the key takeaways, I think, are really significant. So first, OmniScience shows that we can train these specialized LLMs in a much more efficient way, compared to those massive general purpose models. Second, it shows that, combining this pre-training and the reasoning distillation is really, really powerful for science. And finally, it shows that even with a smaller size, a specialized model can't outperform much larger models if it's trained for the right task.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive into OmniScience. We've seen how they built it, how it works, and even how they put it to work in this really interesting battery agent application. And for me, the aha moment here is just realizing the power of this targeted training and what these models can do for scientific progress. It's really exciting.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, what other scientific fields could benefit from specialized models like this, and what kind of breakthroughs could we see? It's a really thought-provoking area.
It is. And for all of you listening, if you wanted to really dig into the technical nitty-gritty of OmniScience, we encourage you to check out the paper. That's it for the deep dive today. Thanks for joining us.